People have plenty of questions about God, and sometimes you have to dig a little bit deeper to get to those answers. In our second installment of my interview with Dr. Paul Copan here on 5 Good Reasons Why God Exists, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this topic of, is God a moral monster? I'm Kerry Decker, your host. We'll be right back. But don't we see the same command resurface during the reign of King Saul when he is commanded to utterly destroy the Amalekites there?
Right. Yeah, the Canaanites were, keep in mind, the Canaanites were in this region where God had promised the Israelites that he would give them this land. And so it is kind of a twofold, it has two sides to it. One is that the time is right for the Canaanites to be judged, which is, again, concurrent with or simultaneous with their opportunity to enter the land that God has promised to them, and not before. So these dovetail and work together, and again, the long-term goal is to bring salvation to the ends of the earth through the Messiah. But with regard to the Amalekites, again, these are a nomadic people kind of spread all throughout this region, again, extending into Egypt and so on, as we read in 1 Samuel 15. Keep in mind that the Amalekites were of a distinct order. Think in terms of terrorism. In terms of an ongoing threat to the Israelites. In fact, yes, they're mentioned in 1 Samuel 15 when Saul is undertaking to attack them. But just in the prior chapter, in chapter 14, verse 48, the Amalekites had just been raiding the Israelites. That they had been again doing this, and throughout the history of Israel coming into the land, what happened after they crossed the Red Sea? There were the Amalekites in Exodus 17 attacking them when they were weak and vulnerable. And again, over and over again, even into the book of Esther, where you see an offspring of King Agag, the Amalekite, Haman, the Agagite, who is now seeking to destroy the Israelites, again, under Persian rule. So this is a long-standing, coming on 1,000 years long animosity against the Israelites. So there is this hostility that is going on here. It's not as though these people are just kind of minding their own business. They have targeted the Israelites. And it's interesting too that even when it talks about Saul, it says that Saul, when he's engaging in battle, he's about to fight against the Amalekites, and there are these Kenites who are part of this. And again, the Kenites were generally a friendly tribe to the Israelites, and they said, we don't have any beef with you, we're going to be fighting against the Amalekites. So the Kenites end up leaving so that Saul can engage in battle with the Amalekites. Now, do you think that there would be women and children there? Even though the language of women and children is used, there is they wouldn't be hanging around the battlefield like that. And then Saul says that he utterly destroyed the Amalekites, and the narrator says Saul utterly destroyed the Amalekites except for King Agag. And again, Saul wanted to bring glory to himself. This was like his prize. He wanted to create a name for himself rather than allowing God's name to be great. So he was really breaching the covenant that God had made with Israel. So kind of interjecting himself into this. Interestingly, we're told that Saul utterly destroyed the Amalekites. In chapter 27 of the same book, 1 Samuel, and then into chapter 30, David is fighting against the Amalekites. And he is fighting again in the same terrain that Saul was fighting in. And we're told that David, he fought against them, defeated them, and 400 people, soldiers from the Amalekites, fled on camels. So again, you see that there's something going on here. There's more than, literal annihilation or destruction here. There's that same language that is being used again, even here. But again, you're right, that is an exception to the general Canaanite warfare. But again, the Amalekites have been a persistent and malicious threat against the Israelites, and so that sort of language is used for them as well.
Yeah. There's a passage of Scripture in the book of Romans, and it says this: "For the one in authority is God's servant for your good." Paul is talking there about the Roman authorities under Nero, and he says that they're God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Talk a little bit about how God uses human agents, both as as a police force to preserve social order in our communities, but also soldiers to provide for national security, and that people are oftentimes the instruments of God's judgment upon others.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that in Romans 13, we do see that the state does have a role. That's the state is the instrument of God's wrath or vengeance. We're not to take personal vengeance, we're told in Romans chapter 12, but to leave room for the wrath of God. And what is that wrath of God? What is that vengeance? Well, again, that is delegated to the state, at least in some measure, to punish those who are evildoers, to protect those who are innocent, and also to preserve the peace. So that's kind of the role that the government has, and again through the army and the police force, that there is a justified use of force. And when the government is doing its job, then it is going to be a good for the people. I think of Paul when his life is under threat. In Acts chapter 23, there's this mob vowing to put Paul to death, and they're not going to eat or drink anything until Paul is dead. Yeah. And so Paul's nephew tells this. Paul tells about this plot, and then Paul tells his nephew to go to the commanding officer and tells him about this threat. And so what ends up happening? Well, Paul gets a military escort of 470 military personnel to take him out of the city up to Caesarea. And basically, he's illustrating what's going on in Romans 12 and 13. Paul is not trying to take vengeance himself, but he's leaving room for the wrath of God, namely allowing the government, the military, to do what it's supposed to do under God, namely to protect the innocent, to punish the guilty. And so he gets help from the military, again, and is escorted out of the city and is protected. Yeah. So there is that. And again, in the Old Testament, we see that God is often using nations to bring judgment on other nations that have been acting wickedly and so forth. Indeed, this is turned on the Israelites themselves when they are acting wickedly, when they're going after idols, when they're making alliances with other nations and so forth. God brings judgment on the northern kingdom of Israel through the Assyrians in 722 BC, and then on the southern kingdom of Judah under the Babylonians in 586, 587 BC. So we see the same sort of thing, that the Israelites are not this perfect nation. They can do no wrong or anything like that. No, God says, if you do the same sorts of things that the Canaanites have done, then the same thing will happen to you. The land is going to vomit you out as well.
Yeah. You've spoken all over the world on this particular topic. Tell me about some of the most common objections that you hear from people when you share these thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes people will, there are a number of questions that are raised. Sometimes people will say, well, what if a terrorist says, well, God told me to blow up a bus full of children. What would you say to that? Or they might raise the question, well, God would not ever, if innocent women and children end up being killed through this command to drive out the Canaanites and so forth, then that would be unjust and so forth, and God could never condone the taking of innocent human life and so forth. Yeah. And so those are some of the objections that will come up. I'll take those in turn. I'll just offer a quick response to the bus load of children. When it comes to terrorism, Just because a terrorist says God told me to blow up a bus full of children isn't the same thing as God actually having told him to do that.
Yeah, yeah.
That's, if one imagines God told him to blow up a bus full of children, that's one thing. But we're talking about a God who is good and just. Saying blow up a bus full of children. Again, this is highly doubtful.
Yeah.
When we look at the question, well, what are the terrorist credentials? Does he have the kind of credentials that Moses and Joshua have? For example, what are the signs and wonders that accompany these commands? Mm-hmm. Is this seen as an exception to the normal operating procedure, or is this the rule by which the terrorist operates? And it is. And what about the moral character of the person who's making these claims? And Jesus says you'll know the true or a false prophet by the fruits of their lives in Matthew 7. Well, what are the fruits of this terrorist's life as opposed to the fruits of Joshua and Moses' lives and so forth? Again, there's a big contrast here. So when we look at, kind of compile the evidence, as it were, to see who is qualified and who is not, the terrorist doesn't have the kind of qualifications that we're talking about. Yeah. Again, keep in mind, this is the exception, not the rule, but the terrorist inverts that and basically is treating this as the rule rather than the exception.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So that's one thing that I would say. In terms of, God could never command something that would involve the taking of innocent human life. Well, one, we know in a just war setting that there will be collateral damage. And as I said before, if there are people who go reoccupy a place where the officials have been driven out, then they open themselves up to harm.
Yeah.
But the main thing to keep in mind here is that if God, a good and just God, commands something, he will have morally sufficient reasons for permitting that. So we can think of an instance where a plane is hijacked, and the terrorists are going to use it as a weapon of mass destruction. And a prime minister or president says, shoot the plane out of the sky.
Yeah.
Well, it would be a justified act, but it would involve the taking of innocent human lives, men, women, and children on board. So we would, or even a woman who, for example, is has an ectopic pregnancy, that the fertilized egg doesn't implant in the uterus but is trapped in the fallopian tube. Well, unless something is done, and namely, unless the unborn child, we would say, valuable life, unless that life is tragically taken, then both the unborn and the woman will survive. So it would be morally justifiable. Unfortunately, again, we're not celebrating it, but it's unfortunate that we'd have to take this innocent human life. But there is a moral justification for doing so. So those are a few examples that if God commands it, then he would have morally justifiable reasons for doing so.
Yeah. When I think about, and I didn't discover some of these things until later on in my life. I guess I didn't pay attention in history when I was in high school and college. But with World War II, is that there was a moment in the Allies', I guess, war strategy. The Germans would just indiscriminately bomb, but then the Allies decided with the bombing of Dresden that we're going to give back what we've gotten, and they bombed a lot of non-combatants in the bombing of Dresden. I don't know, I'd have to sort that through whether or not that was morally justified. But quite frankly, I'm glad that the Allies won World War II versus the Nazis and the Axis power and the Japanese.
Right. Yeah, and even when it comes to, I had two great aunts and a great uncle who survived the bombing of Dresden. They came from Lithuania and they were there, and so they told about it in very vivid terms. As I was growing up, and they were very grateful for the Allies, frankly, and what they were doing to stop the German aggression, the Nazi aggression. And so again, I'm not saying that it was all justified, but one could understand that there are, when nothing else seems to be working, perhaps this is a wake-up call for those who are engaged in these sorts of acts, or even the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah,
it was done. Keep this in mind. Whatever one thinks of it, and again, there are debates that argue for one side and the other. But I think what is clear is that when the command was given by Truman to engage in to drop the bombs, it was not something that was lightly undertaken. It was not something that was done with a glib mindset that, oh, go right ahead. It was a very heavy, very distressing decision to make, a kind of last resort decision to make. This was not the act of someone who is a madman, a crazy man who had access to the nuclear button. This was something that was a much more principled decision. And so we need to keep that in mind as well. Again, however we land on that issue.
Yeah. It's always easy for us, this side of history, to pass judgment on those folks who went before us.
Yeah, and especially when you think about Tokyo had already been firebombed, but that with a great loss of life. But still, that did not affect them. And also, the Allies knew that especially those who served in the Pacific theater of war, that they saw the brutality of the Japanese, and when they heard that Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been bombed, they thought, well, so what? That's not going to affect them at all. That's not going to change them one whit, because they had seen how brutal, how homicidal they were, the kamikazes and so forth. That this is the sort of thing that they thought, well, it's probably not going to do anything. It's not going to put a dent in them, because they had seen the kind of brutality of the Japanese in this Pacific theater of operations.
Yeah, my dad was a vet from World War II, and he did photo recon in the China, Burma, India theater. Yeah. And so I remember as a kid going through his war photos of what the Japanese did, and just the atrocities that they would commit against the villagers in China and in Burma and those places, where he'd go in and he had photos of groups of children that the Japanese would come in and just behead and put their heads the entrance to the town or the village there as a warning that you need to capitulate to the Japanese or suffer the same punishment.
Right. It was a horrific time and horrific actions carried out by the Japanese, unfortunately. And
so I guess the point that I'm making on that is that we tend to stand here in the 21st century peering way back into the Old Testament, and with the expectation that those folks should have behaved according to our standards, But it's an entirely different world. So before we wrap up here today, Paul, share with me any final thoughts on this topic or additional insights that you'd like to pass along.
Yeah. Well, just maybe one thing. I mean, apart from, if you want to read more about this, take a look at my book, Is God a Moral Monster? Or the book that Matthew Flanagan and I co-authored called Did God Really Command Genocide?, which goes in a lot more detail on this very topic. In my book, I quote the theologian from the former Yugoslavia, Miroslav Volf, who's now at Yale. But he talked about how he had, as a young theologian, didn't like the idea of a God who was angry or wrathful until he experienced the warfare in his own land, when his own people were shelled day in and day out, and 3 million people were displaced. Hundreds of thousands of people killed and so forth. A terrible time for his people. And he said, and I couldn't imagine God not being angry. That he said these kinds of atrocities were so brutal that he couldn't worship a God who didn't get angry at these sorts of things, who wasn't wrathful about these things. And he said that so often we pit love and wrath against each other. He said God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. He is wrathful because he is love.
Yeah, exactly.
And comes from his own loving nature, and that God steps in to act and to stop the atrocities, to stop the brutality, to stop the dehumanization. And when we don't have the full picture, we wish we knew more. But when we look at the Canaanites, we realize that there is something more going on here. That there are a lot of things at stake. There's a cosmic battle going on. Mm-hmm. The salvation of the world is in the balance. That there are people who are acting wickedly, who are a pernicious influence and can threaten to undermine the cause of salvation to the ends of the earth through Israel and Jesus the Messiah. And so we ought to see this in more cosmic terms, that there is a cosmic battle going on here, and that God is, in issuing these commands to drive out the Canaanites and so forth, recognizes better than the Israelites themselves know that so much is at stake here, and that this fledgling nation that could be crushed, that could be overrun through sexual immorality and idolatry and breaking covenant with the one true God, that everything could be compromised. And so there is a certain severity that we need to understand here, and that God is doing so because he is love. God has loving intentions beyond the Israelites, beyond even the Canaanites who are being driven out. God desires to see salvation come to the ends of the earth, that even the enemies of his people will come to embrace the one true Messiah.
Wow, yeah, such good stuff. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today, discussing this important topic. I think that this has been a stumbling block for a lot of folks, and you certainly have shed plenty of light on the topic. And I would encourage folks to get a copy of your book. I've read it myself and underlined it and thought seriously about it. Is God a Moral Monster? You can find that on Amazon and purchase a copy there. And I think that you'll be truly blessed as a result of reading it. We have plenty of great content here on 5 good reasons why God exists. And we not only want to talk about the positive reasons that we find why God exists, but we also want to deal with the challenges that people have to the Christian faith and to the belief in God. And hopefully, by thinking a little bit more deeply about some of these topics, you'll be able to kind of overcome those obstacles for yourself. So keep watching. There's plenty of great content coming your way. We'll see you later.